Hello and welcome to this special Sir David Martin event in support of Youth Recovery Month. My name is Will Martin. I'm the chair of Sir David Martin Foundation, and I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands upon which we all stand, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders and their leaders, past, present and emerging. Now, for over 30 years, Sir David Martin Foundation has been helping and supporting some of Australia's most vulnerable young people. Indeed, it's our core business to raise funds in support of best practice, youth-specific drug and alcohol treatment programs. That's why we're here, to raise awareness and understanding about youth addiction. And we don't want to just be part of the conversation, we want to lead the conversation. This panel and other initiatives, such as our recent Don't Judge Me awareness campaign, seek to lift the lid on some of these more complex, challenging and uncomfortable issues, all with a view to removing the barriers that are getting in the way of young people seeking and receiving the appropriate care they need when they need it. We really appreciate you being here, and I'm now going to hand over to author, columnist and journalist Jacinta Tyner, who's going to moderate the panel. And I thank you all for being here. Jacinta, over to you.
So I muted myself there. It's a rookie mistake, isn't it? Thank you, Will, and welcome to everybody. And thank you so much for sparing the time this evening to come along to this seminar. It's going to be incredibly informative. We are with the experts in the field, and it's just, I think, very important conversation, obviously, for all of us, for the entire community, not those of us who are just working with young people or who have young kids. We're all responsible, aren't we, for the welfare of our young. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation. So let's dive in. Obviously, the panel event is part of Youth Recovery Month. And tonight we're going to be diving into some of the touchy subjects. That is, of course, the title of the conversation surrounding youth drug and alcohol addiction. We'll be talking about stigma, barriers to receiving treatment, and the way in which our society judges young people. The question we're going to ask is judgment of young people limiting their potential to lead healthy and happy lives? And what can we do better? So during the event, all of our online audience, you'll all be muted, but you'll see that there is a chat box. You can see that down the bottom of your screens, I hope, where you can post comments, and we will have a Q&A at the end of the session where you can post your questions, and we will do our best, of course, to get to as many of those as we can. Some people have already pre-submitted those, so we'll start with those. But if you have any, please do. If you have any questions, please do submit those. As I think we probably all know by now, sometimes in the virtual world, not everything goes to plan, but we will be doing our best, of course. And most of us are joining tonight from our homes. Many of us are in lockdown with kids and pets and a multitude of distractions in the background. So if the Zoom video or sound isn't working perfectly for you, just try refreshing your browser, close down any extra apps or programs running on your device. I think we've all got the gist of this, haven't we, over the last year or so? We haven't had a choice but to become tech savvy. But also, if anything goes wrong, don't worry, because the full video recording will also be available after the event, so you can catch it then. We want to acknowledge tonight that there is possibly triggering content that will be discussed, so please just be mindful of that and reach out if you need help. We're going to have some links in the chat about places where you can go if you need to discuss anything. So let's get started. Our panel brings together a group of esteemed people who are all passionate about the health and well-being of young people and bringing together a wealth of lived experience and professional expertise to look at this topic from a few different angles. Now, unfortunately, this is a bit of a shame, but our first scheduled speaker, Ellie Reinhardt, is no longer able to join us tonight. Isn't that a shame? She started to feel unwell earlier today, so she sends her apologies, and we send our best wishes, of course, to her. But many of you will know Ellie as the Sir David Martin Foundation's Youth Ambassador, and she is, of course, a graduate of the Triple Care Farm Youth Drug and Alcohol Treatment Centre. She is known to many of you because she gave an incredibly powerful speech at a recent foundation fundraising event. And as you know, Ellie Reinhardt is a young woman who is passionate about raising awareness of the complex issues surrounding youth drug and alcohol addiction and mental illness. So we're going to put a link to Ellie's speech in the post-event email so you can still hear all about her journey. It is well worth watching. But don't worry, because we do have an incredible panel with us tonight. So let's introduce them now. We have with us, I'm just going to go through who all the speakers are, and then we're going to hear from them all individually. But I'll introduce to you first Indigenous youth mentor Steve Bastian, who is a proud Yorta Yorta man. He was recently awarded the prestigious Health, Wellbeing and Community Services Student of the Year at the TAFE New South Wales Gilly Awards, which recognises Aboriginal student achievement. Steve is studying for his diploma in youth work and is deeply passionate about mentoring at-risk Aboriginal young people. So we are extremely lucky to have you here tonight. Lucy Stronach is the current Australian youth representative to the United Nations. In the past year, Lucy has toured Australia to identify the concerns, needs and experiences of diverse and underrepresented young people, which she will present back to the Australian government and the UN General Assembly. She's a graduate of studies in criminology and law, and Lucy is an advocate for youth justice in both at home and internationally. Professor Dan Lubman, AM, is the Executive Clinical Director of Turning Point and Professor of Addiction Studies and Services at Monash University. He's worked across mental health and drug treatment settings in the UK and Australia. And as one of the country's leading addiction specialists, Dan featured prominently in last year's landmark SBS series, which many of you would have seen, Addicted Australia, and the subsequent Rethink Addiction public awareness campaign, both of which are driving real change in conversations about addiction in our community. And our final panelist is Dr. Suzie Hudson. Suzie is the Clinical Director at the Network of Alcohol and Other Drugs Agencies. She's an accredited mental health social worker and has over 16 years clinical experience in the fields of substance misuse, mental health, forensics, research, and evaluation. She has a PhD in public health and community medicine and a passion for engaging with social change. So how's that for a panel? Pretty esteemed and a lot of knowledge here, all in one room. I want to say room, all in one Zoom meeting here tonight. So Steve, let's start with you. You are, of course, as we mentioned, an Indigenous youth mentor and recently recognised with that wonderful Gilly Award. Can you start by telling us what it was that led you into youth work and mentoring, and why you think that you have that knack for being able to get through, to be able to relate to so many young people?
Yeah, it's definitely lived experience. So, you know, when I was young, I didn't have that mentor there, so I was sort of lost, even though I still had my parents there, my stepfather and my mother. I still felt lost, you know. I just didn't have that. I had my older brother to look up to, but yeah, he just wasn't that kind of mentor, if you know what I mean. I just believe having a mentor at around those times can guide you a lot better and just help you get on the right track a lot better. Me myself didn't have that at the time, so I went on the wrong track, and I went down the track of addiction, fighting. My main addiction was alcohol. I became an alcoholic. I was a binge drinker, alcoholic. Apparently that's worse because you're consuming a lot more alcohol than an alcoholic would. So it put a lot of damage on my body as well through the years. And and then that leads to drugs, of course. And it's all to pretty much escape reality, as we all know. And like I said, it led me to fighting, get myself in a lot of trouble. So I just believe if I had a mentor that I could relate to, that like really related to me, not as much like I said, my brother, my mother and all that, they were there, but I didn't have that relate, if you know what I mean, even though we are related. It's just it's like a bigger brother kind of thing. And I just break it all down to mentoring and positive role model.
So when you are involved in mentoring, which you obviously do so much of, how do you think that helps the kids young people who are going through their own issues? How do you think it helps them relate to you, knowing that you've been there as well? Do you obviously tell them that? Does that help them relate to you a bit better?
No, that's the thing. I don't tell them nothing. The kids are smart. They're very smart, and they have a real good bullshit radar, as we all know. And so if you try to bullshit them, and if you haven't lived that life and you say you have, they're not silly. They know. The difference is they relate to you because they can see that you have had that life. They just smart. They just know you've had a hard life. They can tell, just the way you are, and they realise, like, they try to work out, how did you get there? So, like I said, they're really smart. They find out, just doing their own little research on you, sort of thing, and they it all makes sense to them. And I find when they do find that relation, it just makes things a lot more easier straight away. Because straight away you start building that trust, you start building that rapport, and like, trust is the main one. So if you can start building that trust, that's your start straight away, because that's your foundation. So you've already started your foundation before you start anything else, which is what you really need to do with every individual that you come to. So, yeah.
So as somebody who's been on the other side, you've been on both sides of it. Why is it that mentoring and guiding people into study and into jobs and just changing the course of their life, I guess, why is it so important when it comes particularly to young Indigenous people who are struggling with addiction and mental health issues? Why is it so vital?
It's so important because if you don't know, Aboriginals have a short lifespan, and that's the biggest issue because a lot of Indigenous are very addictive people. So it could even be arts and craft, and you could be addicted to it. But then if it turns to drugs, then you're addicted to it. If you turn to alcohol, you're addicted to it. We're a very high addictive nation, and so, like I said, we have a shorter lifespan. So that's the scary part. And to have a high Indigenous rate to be very addicted to drugs, alcohol, even incarceration, getting locked up all the time, in and out of jail, all of those sort of things. You can, hopefully you can sort of see, it's a ongoing issue. It's a big issue, and something's got to be done. Pretty much, look, we've got to try and break the chain or break the cycle in some way or another. I'm only one person, but my goal was people to hear me and understand and maybe take on a bit what I'm saying and join the team.
Did you feel, Steve, when you were struggling with the issues that you so generously shared with us today, did you feel that you were judged by others for that?
I guarantee you, if you're, like I said, if you're on something, drugs or alcohol or something that's addictive that someone else isn't addicted to, straight away they don't understand that situation. So when that situation occurs, they, say they're a worker and they don't have that addiction, but they could be a smoker. They've got to really look in their own backyard and think, well, I'm addicted to cigarettes. Can I quit? If you think you can't quit, then that's your understanding of what this other person's going through.
And so I think that with mentoring, it's a fine line, isn't it, between showing compassion for the person you're mentoring, but that doesn't mean then excusing their dangerous or harmful behaviour, does it? So how do you get that fine line between saying, I'm here for you, but I don't like what you're doing?
Just be straight up, just be honest. Like I said, they got a real good bullshit radar. So if you try to kid them, they won't want nothing to do with you. If you try to steer them forcefully, they want nothing to do with you. So you just got to, like I said, build that trust, build that rapport, try to have that relation happening. And then, if you have that, everything just falls in place for you.
Well, you're obviously doing amazing work and using your past experience for good, and that's just extraordinary. I mean, so many young kids must be so grateful that they've got you in their corner. Thank you for your time tonight, Steve. We'll keep you here, obviously, for the Q&A, so we'll be back to you shortly.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to bring in Lucy Stronach now, who Lucy is obviously the current Australian youth representative to the UN. Hello, it doesn't get better than that, does it? So Lucy, I'm going to start by asking you, oh, there you are. It's so funny doing these virtual events, isn't it? It's like, where are you? Yeah, there you are in that box. Yes. Lucy, I wanted to start by asking you, it is time to broaden the conversation and look at what some of the biggest issues facing young people today are. As in your role as youth representative to the UN, I'll just keep, every time I say that, I think how extraordinary is that? What's that?
It's a bit of a mouthful.
No, I'm just saying how extraordinary it is to have that role. It's just such an incredible honour. You've been out listening to young people, gaining their perspectives for some time now. What are some of the biggest concerns that you've been hearing about?
Yeah, so I mean, that effectively was my job for the last year or so, was traveling the country, which I somehow managed to do in this COVID world. I don't know how. I just got very, very lucky with it. So I had the privilege of speaking to thousands of young Australians and having these conversations about, firstly, the biggest issues that they were facing, but also, you know, how we're going to solve them. What are we actually going to do about it? And unsurprisingly, our young people are so educated and so passionate and clever and came up with amazing solutions. But in terms of the issues, and if I'm going to keep it, I guess, a bit broader because there are a billion I could bring up, but we did talk about gender inequality quite a bit, specifically sexual assault and harassment. I think they're very prominent issues right now. Unsurprisingly, what's going on in our political system, generally in our social system. So that was brought up very frequently. The lack of political representation of young people as well, and how hard it is for them to have their voices heard despite having very strong voices. Obviously, climate change, that's a no-brainer, that gets brought up a lot. LGBTQ plus rights was really commonly brought up as well. A lot of our young people are now exploring their sexuality, their gender diversity, and as that's becoming more accepted and that stigma, I think, is declining, we're having more and more conversations about how to accommodate young people from those experiences. Healthcare was another really big one, so that the state of our physical and mental health care systems and young people feeling that disproportionately. And I think the other main area that we really spoke about was Indigenous rights as well. Interestingly enough, tying this all to sort of judgment and stigma as well for these conversations, a lot of the time we did speak of these issues, young people would bring up, I guess, the judgment or shame attached to them, and then how difficult it was for them to seek help or find solutions and sort of actively overcome a lot of these issues. And obviously that's quite problematic. So, I mean, as one example, because I know we're pressed for time, a massive issue, as I mentioned, we talked about was healthcare system and specifically mental health. I heard countless stories of the difficulties young people faced in accessing mental health services. So a lot of young people were waiting, you know, up to 6 months to see a psychologist. Some of them had to travel 6-7 hours to their nearest psychologist, which meant missing a day of school. And that was the young people who felt brave enough, I guess, to speak about their experiences and actually seek that help. A lot of the time, there were young people who felt like there was too much shame and stigma from their communities, from their parents, from their friends, that they couldn't actually get that help. And so obviously, you know, young people are really feeling the impacts of judgment, and it's having a really critical impact on their health and well-being. But what was, I guess, quite impressive to see as well was when we discussed, I guess, solutions to these problems and how do we stop this judgment and stigma. And almost every single time the answer was education. And that's why obviously sort of conversations like this are really powerful and creating dialogue, because, you know, if we can empower our young people and give them the tools and the knowledge on how to overcome these issues, whilst also, I guess, simultaneously educating those around them, I guess we can reduce that stigma, that judgment, and ultimately, you know, help our young people.
And you mentioned the LGBTQI community feeling that judgment and stigma is being reduced. So I think that's such a great example of that there's hope there, that if people are educated, then they can start to see things from others' perspective and the judgment can dissipate. What about when it comes to judgment in a court of law? So how do we currently judge young people in the justice system, and what are the impacts of this? Do we need to be doing anything differently here?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, this is one of the most obvious applications of that word judgment, right? Where, you know, a young person commits an offence, is charged with that offence, appears, I guess, before a magistrate, who then determines a sentence or a judgment based on their actions. And not more often than not, but quite a lot of the time, this will end up with a sort of a custodial sentence or prison. So, you know, in Australia, we're judging young people as young as 10 for their actions, and we're deeming them rational and aware and responsible enough to foresee the consequences of their actions, despite the fact that we judge young people not responsible enough to drive until they're 16 or vote till they're 18, which is a ridiculous sentiment to me. So I sort of, through my experiences, have had the privilege of working with a lot of those young people at Banksia Hill Detention Centre, which is WA's maximum security facility for children. And unfortunately, this, I don't believe, is really a place of growth or for learning or rehabilitation. It really is a place of judgment, despite, I think, the best efforts of the staff to counter that. But as soon as you remove a child from their community and you put them in a cell behind a barbed wire fence, that stigma and that judgment exists, and it has a really, you know, perverse effect. And from what I've seen, I guess, like, sort of three main areas where I've seen that judgment really have an impact. Firstly would be in young people's own perspectives on, I guess, their abilities and their future capabilities. While working in Banksia Hill, I heard countless times young people say, you know, I committed XYZ offence because, you know, everyone told me I was going to anyway. And this real sort of idea of the labelling theory or self-fulfilling prophecy, where they're perpetuating these stereotypes just because they feel like the community expects them to anyway. So, you know, a real factor in a young person's offending can be those labels and that judgment that society's placed on them. I guess secondly, an issue with it is that we're not addressing the root causes of offending. So many, in fact, more kids in detention than not come from low SES backgrounds. They might have a history of family violence, addiction, and most of them have a history of trauma. And furthermore, you know, we look at like the 2018 Banksia Hill study that was conducted by the Telethon Kids Institute, and that found that 9 out of 10 kids had a severe neuro impairment or disability. So a lot of these young people face such difficult situations when critically thinking and making rational decisions. And this is largely, you know, due to circumstances outside of their control. So judgment really is the easy way out in these situations. It requires little empathy, and more often than not doesn't actually require that examination of root causes of offending. And I guess lastly, it doesn't reduce crime. That's the bottom line. Generally, recidivism, or like the reoffending rate in Australia sits anywhere between 40 and 90%, and young men are the kind of most at-risk category. So that means that a young person is more likely to return to prison or to corrections than to their community. It also costs nearly $1,000 a day to hold a young person in detention. So not only is this a system of judgment that doesn't work, it's a tremendous waste of money and really causes more harm to our community than good. And just to quickly wrap up, I'd say the positive in this is that we are moving towards, I guess, the more rehabilitative model focused on reintegration. And so we're seeing like ideas like social justice reinvestment, diversion programs, community-based orders. They're really growing in, I guess, popularity in terms of instead of custodial sentencing. And that's what I guess I'd really like to stress, is that these responses and the change we have to make has to be community-led. And as a lot of criminal justice practitioners would know, responses to crime cannot be one size fits all. They have to be unique. They have to be tailored to that specific community or that young person. So, you know, really the future of criminal justice isn't a model that's based on judgment and shame, but it's one based on understanding and compassion, and particularly focusing on those unique factors that contribute to a young person's experiences.
That's just so fascinating, Lizzie. Thank you. It's extraordinary that judgment is our default and we don't even realise that we're doing it half the time. Thank you so much for those insights and for sharing your knowledge there. And we'll talk to you again in the Q&A. The next speaker is Professor Dan Lubman. And he is, of course, as I said, the Executive Clinical Director of Turning Point and Professor of Addiction Studies and Services at Monash University. So, Professor, I'm trying to see you there on the screen, but I know you're there somewhere. Can I ask you, first of all, if you could explain why addiction is so misunderstood as a health condition and why stigma is such a barrier to people reaching out for help for addiction, especially when they're young?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And look, it's great to follow on from Steve and Lucy. I mean, they really eloquently sort of set up this whole issue for us. And I mean, really, when we think about addiction in the public domain, we're often thinking that, people who develop these problems are essentially either people who just can't control themselves, are somehow weak-willed, or in some ways, they make bad choices and they're bad people. And that's the framing, that moralistic framing is how we view addiction. And that's how we viewed it for many centuries, in fact. And unfortunately, some of the ways in which the narrative around alcohol and drugs and our drug policy reinforce those stereotypes. So obviously, there's a big tension around how we think about illicit drugs, like alcohol and tobacco, and illicit drugs, and such as cannabis and heroin, cocaine, and how that's framed in the public discourse. And what we hear is good news stories about alcohol and how alcohol and gambling and other those behaviours are to be celebrated and promoted, as we see heavily throughout our TV and in our magazines and on the news. And otherwise, what we see is in illicit drugs being those bad choices and only bad people, and the people who use them are bad in some way. So we see that sort of very dichotomous view around these substances. And we all enjoy, many people in the community enjoy to gamble, enjoy to drink. And so what we think is if people who tend to drink too much or tend to gamble too much, or tend to use drugs, it's because they do that because they just lose control. They enjoy things too much and they just can't control themselves. And we need to really come down hard on them. And it links to Lucy's point before, which was really about, the idea is we need to punish people when they make bad choices. And even though we know that approach doesn't work at all. And so because we frame it in this moralistic sort of setting, and we have these very strong views about it, what people believe, when people think about developing a problem themselves, they see it very much in the context that they're bad people. They make poor choices, they internalize sort of all those commentary from the public and internalize that stigma, and really don't admit it to themselves for a long time, and don't want to, or don't know how to reach out and seek support. And that stigma creates a whole range of barriers to help, to support. And we know that addiction is the most stigmatized health condition globally. We know that it can take up to 20 years for people to seek help, which if we were talking about cancer or any other health condition, it would be a national sort of, tragedy and a national outrage. But this is the reality, and this is why it's important that we're having these conversations.
Yes, indeed. There's so many amazing points in there. You would be known to many people here watching tonight as part of a groundbreaking series on SBS last year called Addicted Australia. It's been described as the most realistic depiction of addiction on our screens ever. What was that program trying to achieve, do you think?
Oh, look, thanks so much for that. I mean, we're very fortunate to work with a brilliant production company, Blackfella Films, who've done a lot of work in addressing some really, challenging issues and really promoting the idea as social inclusion, social justice. What we were trying to do is, if you look in your newspapers and on your TV sets or in the movies, and we look at what depictions of addiction are, they're not real depictions. What we see in the movies is we see these caricatures that most people don't identify with. We see stories, as you know, in most of the newspapers that are really focused on these negative portrayals about people being bad people, about being criminals. We hear no good news stories. We don't hear the message that people get help or support like we do for other health conditions. In fact, when I started my training as a medical student quite a long time ago now, I would see people in our surgical clinics, who had really significant cancer, and they'd had it for a long time, but they felt that cancer was a death sentence. They felt that cancer was somehow to blame. And so they used to delay help seeking until they had, really significant cancer. And what we've seen is an evolution in how we approach cancer now, and we have pink test matches, and we have lots of people telling their stories, and we see all these champions, and we don't hear those stories around addiction. And what we were trying to do in this show is really, demonstrate what those real stories were, who the real people are. There, as people who would have seen the show, they're people like you and me, and people we know, and people in our community, and people in our family. We need to know that, another big myth that we were trying to bust was that treatment works. Most of the community doesn't think treatment works because of these bad news stories. So we were trying to bust that myth that treatment does work, that change is possible, and, really trying to promote that message of hope. And we hope that got through, because those really 10 brave individuals and their families really put their lives out there on the TV, really to try and help others who are struggling in this space.
Yeah, that's right. It's so generous of people to get rid of that stigma and shame and open up, because that's how everybody else manages to see themselves and realize that there's hope in there. So thank you so much for that, Professor Dan Lubman, and we'll talk to you in the Q&A. And now we are going to cross to Dr. Suzie Hudson, and she's, of course, the Clinical Director at the Network of Alcohol and Other Drugs Agencies and many other things. Suzie, thank you so much for joining us. And just going to start by asking you straight up, what can we be doing better to help young people struggling with substance abuse?
It's a very good question, Jacinta, and I think it really leverages off all that people have been talking about this evening. And that is, firstly, that we listen to them, and certainly that's what everybody's been saying tonight, particularly Steve and Lucy. We know that young people know themselves and are learning more every day, that when we actually stop and listen to their opinions and their thoughts, particularly around this issue, they do have some good solutions themselves. But I think just picking up particularly on what Dan's been talking about, there's a real missed opportunity we have, that every person in the community has an opportunity to break down the stigma and discrimination experienced, particularly by young people who may be using alcohol and other drugs. We don't often think about the power of those side conversations we may have at a gathering or on the phone or at work, that are very judgmental about people who use alcohol and other drugs. And what we often don't quite appreciate is that what that means for those who may be facing challenges associated with their substance use. It makes them feel that additional sense of shame, and it stops them reaching out for support. And so what we need to do as a community is we need to really check ourselves in terms of the narrative that we portray in our conversations with family, with friends, that we really address and start to recognise that people who use alcohol and other drugs are just like us. They're just people. They want to have the same hopes and dreams. They use substances for a myriad of reasons. And so when it comes to young people, it's essential that we hear, that we open the door to those conversations, that they feel it's possible to talk to us. And as Steve's quite rightly pointed out, that it's not just the reliance on immediate family, so parents, can be a very difficult experience for them, and brothers and sisters and aunts. It's also, what other people are there in the community that could be, that they could reach out to. And if we don't start as a community trying to break down the stigma that's associated with substance use itself, then, as Dan quite rightly points out, we know that people do not reach out for help until a very until things have really become quite unmanageable. I think a really good example of that has been in the past our campaigns related to methamphetamine use. What we know is that those campaigns meant that lots of people, both who were using the drug or who were supporting or family members, just simply shut down and did not reach out for support until very far down the track. And what we know then is if they were struggling or they were experiencing difficulties, that they were being exacerbated, that their mental health issues were escalating. And that was really due to this real fear, this very massive campaign that stigmatized people and continues to do so, actually. And so I think it's actually, the good news is we've all got an opportunity as community members to start to break that down and to really listen hard to what young people need and want.
You talked then about the families of the users as well, and I wanted to ask you about that obviously it's not when a young person is struggling with addiction, they're not the only ones it impacts, because they're still at home and they're still dependents a lot of the time. It takes a toll on the whole family unit. Do you think that the parents of young people struggling with substance abuse feel judged too?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think one of the key issues there is that we also, through that, ongoing stigmatizing experience, means that parents and family members feel like they can't reach out for assistance as well. They are silenced often. And so what that then means is it puts a huge amount of pressure on a family system. They feel very responsible and often blame themselves. And really at the heart of it, parents and those who care for young people are frightened that people are going to die. And that's the reality of where parents go. That's or family or loved ones are supporting a young person who may be struggling with substance use. And so one of the key things we really know works is that those people also need support. They also need to reach out for their assistance. Sometimes we can focus, absolutely, if the young person is in a position where they would like some support or they feel ready for that, then we should absolutely make it easy as we possibly can for them. But as a parent or someone who's worried about someone else's substance use, it's really important that you yourself reach out for your assistance as well, because we know that what can happen then within a family dynamic is that the pressure of that concern and that worry can really compound the experience. And so it's a really useful thing to have your own space to talk about what your worries and concerns are. And so, the stigma is happening all over the place, but not just for the young person, but also their family as well. And so those who are involved, they need their supports. And we need to make sure that our community knows that they're available. And that's the other thing we perhaps need to do better, is that, as Dan quite rightly pointed out, we get a lot of our information about not only drug use, but drug treatment from the television. But there's nothing really clearly saying, hey, did you know that, people use alcohol and other drugs? Some people experience issues with that use. And did you know there's a spectrum of opportunities for treatment? Certainly, it's a very under-resourced field. I'd have to, put a little plug in for that. That it's it's largely poorly resourced. However, there are a range of services that are available, and it would be great if the community knew what they were. That residential treatment is one of many options, and we really need to tailor that treatment to the person who's reaching out for assistance.
Great, Suzie, thank you. That's such amazing points that you've also raised. Gosh, it's also a fascinating conversation tonight already. We've had quite a few questions coming in for the Q&A. I'm just going to start by one that was pre-submitted, actually, and let me just find that. There's so many great questions. I'm trying to work out where to start, but I think this is one that many people are probably asking. And Suzie, I may as well ask this one of you, but if anyone else wants to jump in and speak to this as well, just let us know. And that is this is a question that's come in. What would you say to people who say drug and alcohol misuse is a choice, that these kids just need to toughen up and start taking responsibility for their actions?
Well, I think what I'd say is that how does that serve them? Either the person who's saying it or the person they're saying it about. You might want to take that position. I'm not sure that it opens a dialogue or supports a person if they were concerned about their substance use to reach out for help if they needed it. In terms of it being a choice, I suppose you need to think about the context in which substance use happens. And there's a huge array of reasons why people use alcohol and other drugs. It's not simplistic. It's very an individual experience. And certainly we know that for the vast majority of people who experience problematic substance use, there are other very significant issues involved, and many of which we've spoken about tonight. Steve talking about the issue of stigmatised, of colonisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the experience of intergenerational trauma, You know, absolutely there's huge resilience there, but we've got a long way to go in terms of supporting our First Nations people. Lucy's talked about, you know, the justice system, how we penalise people very strongly. And Dan, of course, is talking about all that stigma and people not really knowing what the real truth is about substance use. So I think, you know, I think in a nutshell, you're really having to think about all of those elements. And I suppose positioning yourself to sort of almost blame the person for their substance use closes the door on their opportunity to reach out for help if indeed they do have a problem.
Yeah, all right. Suzie, thank you so much for that. That's a really good points there. And Steve, I thought that might be one that we could ask you about, that if you could just say briefly that question, I'll say the question again, but it's about what do you say to people who say that drug and alcohol misuse is a choice and the kids just need to take responsibility for that?
Yeah, I agree. That's not the approach that you come to them with, you know what I mean? Because that kind of approach just is already judging straight away. So you don't want to come with that approach. You want to come with the approach of, you know, why are they doing that? You know what I mean? Not the fact that they choose to do that. The fact is, why are they doing that? And then that's when you start finding out the you know, the underbelly of what's really going on and why they are making that choice in the first place.
Yeah, it's such a good point to start with that. I know that Professor Dan Lubman has, thanks Stephen, Professor Dan Lubman has something he'd like to say on that point as well. I'm sure you do, Professor. Yeah,
I just want to just echoing what Steve said, which is a really brilliant point. I mean, I think what often, I mean, and particularly when we're talking here about problematic use, I mean, often when we see people, you know, most of the people we see, you know, recognize that it's an issue themselves and want to do something about it, but they don't know what to do and why they're doing it. And as, you know, Steve so eloquently said, you know, often people are doing it, but they don't know why. And so when you're telling, you know, somebody to stop doing something they don't understand why they're doing, because they don't understand the function of that in their life. And that's the critical question, not, you know, what you're doing, but why you're doing it, and helping people to understand that. And I would say that the issue is that many people don't know. They don't know. We know that substances generally are great emotional analgesics. They're really great. We all use them to change our mental state in some ways. They're really good at shutting down. They're really great at shutting down difficult emotions, and we all use them, particularly during lockdown. Many of us have been using them to cope with some of the stresses of homeschooling and working at home and being isolated and disconnected. So I think there's a lot of greater appreciation of that over this year. But it's really about understanding that for many people, it is a solution to another problem. And really, the question should be, what is that other underlying problem that we need to address when this is the only solution that you have at the moment to deal with it? And how can we help you think about some alternatives?
Yeah, it's all coming back to that same theme, isn't it? Which is just, I'm sure a lot of parents who are listening would be really appreciative of that concept, that you need to know the why. There's so many great questions that are coming in. I'm sorry to those who I don't get to, but I'm just going to randomly pick some because they're all just so great. This question is, does the panel have any advice for parents or family about talking to their kids if they're worried that your kids won't listen to you, and what you should do about that? So let me see. Well, who would be good to answer that? It might be just staying on you, Dan, for that one, I think. And then if anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been fortunate to do a lot of work with parents, and there's a great parenting resort. Parenting Strategies is a great resource for parenting, particularly in this space. And I think the thing is that often parents don't realize how important they are, even when they feel disconnected and feel like they're not being listened to. The key advice I would give is about staying in there and being that support. And yes, there might be challenges around how you're communicating with each other at the moment, and how feeling that you're not getting through. And I think it's about being honest together about that this isn't working, but that you do still love and want to support them. And it's about what are the ways in which we can work at this together. So I think it is about, as Suzie said before, it is about reaching out and getting other help. There's lots of great programs out there for parents and families to sort of learn around what the different approaches are, what services are out there, how to navigate the system, how to make sure you look after yourself so that you stay strong to look after your loved one. So, but the key thing is, I think, stick in there. If you are concerned, if you don't feel you're getting through, please stick in there. This is not, something that we can fix overnight, but it is about looking for solutions and looking for other support to work out, what to do. That's what we would do for any other condition. If we had another health condition that our loved one was struggling with and we didn't know what to do, we'd go and get expert advice, we'd seek other professionals, we'd get support. And really that's, I feel, something that we need to do. But, congratulations for being concerned and sticking in there, and really want to say, look for the long road.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jacinta. I just think, we've learned a lot, even in the drug and alcohol business, like in the treatment sector. We used to be actually pretty bad at including friends and family in treatment. We used to be quite clear that they should go away and that we were going to work our magic, and then we would return them, back into the family unit. And we know that that's just crazy. I mean, this is all, everyone can be part of the solution. And so, yes, it can be extremely difficult, and there will be times where parents or family members or friends, can't be right in the picture. But the point that Dan's making is so important. Do whatever you can to stay as close as you can. There can be tough times, but we know that the better outcomes are when, ultimately there's someone sticks alongside, they get the support that they need as a carer or a supporter of someone. They maintain boundaries, of course. We know that that's important, but to know that, it's tricky and we don't always have the answers. And so the other thing I would say to the person is that not feeling like you have to have all the answers, talking to your young person and having them educate you, use that as an opportunity. Tell me about this. I don't know anything about it. Can you tell me more about it? What should I read? I think that's another thing, that you go and you try to really open up conversations rather than shutting them down.
All right, I'm just reading, thank you for that, Suzie, and I'm just reading this question here. It's quite a long one, so I'm just trying to get to the gist. The members of the panel have such a wide and extensive range of lived and professional experience, which is amazing. Yes, it is. What advice would you give to workplaces when looking at introducing potential positions for those with lived experience in the industry? I guess how can workplaces continue to support people in these roles to navigate challenges? I guess, if I'm right, the question is asking workplaces who are looking to employ people who have had substance abuse in the past. Who'd like to speak to that?
Yeah, I'll speak to that, because I got the role Indigenous mentor for Campbell Page. So that's right up my alley. That's exactly what I'm doing. It's only early days. So there's a lot more, to be done. But my side is the Indigenous, of course, as you know. And I believe with Indigenous, it's a very slow road. But the good thing about that slow road is that when you get to that end of that road, you become a community, and that's how you stay. You just stay as a community. So it is worth doing that slow road, because you end up part of the community at the end of that slow road. In saying that, is with Campbell Page, I've put across, which is good, because when I went for the role, they understood what I was putting across as well, was you have to do the holistic approach. And that's what is out there with youth work and all that now, for that very reason, because it's so easy to say to someone, go and look for a job, get off your bum, stop being lazy, go look for a job, this and that. It's so easy to say that, but it's not that easy to do. And it's not the fact of, there's not much jobs out there either. It could be the fact of that person getting to a phone in the first place, know how to use that phone and make that call. So for all that to happen, there's all these steps before they actually go for that job, even before an interview. So that's my goal with Indigenous Mentor, is to try to build that confidence for them, build that independency, make them feel ready with everything else, and not even so much on the employment side, even though it does lead to employment, even on the education side. There might be literacy, numeracy. We gotta work out what, as you do, weakness, strength, and build on that. So yeah, you find that weakness, you build on that weakness, and try to turn it to a strength. If you can turn that to a strength, then to me, it's halfway there. You know what I mean? You're definitely not there yet, but you're halfway there, and you're building that foundation, like I said before, to lead you to employment.
Yeah, and you are living proof of that, aren't you, Steve? That's such
am living.
Such a great role model.
Yeah.
I might just quickly jump in as well, just because I guess I've seen the firsthand impact that people with lived experience have in that space as well. I mean, like I mentioned, I traveled the country working with a lot of disadvantaged and vulnerable young people, and a lot of them had interactions with the justice system, and the best mentors they had were those with lived experience. You just see their faces light up when they see that someone who is one of their role models, who's playing sport with them, educating them, hanging out with them, and has, I guess, turned around their life for the better. You've seen them be able to relate to that and go, I can achieve that one day. I can actually really work towards this goal. And that relationship that I've seen young people have with mentors with lived experiences, it's completely unparalleled to those who don't have that lived experience. And I think workplaces need to start realizing the value of people with those experiences and not dismissing them because there may be challenges associated with that. It's part of the package, and it's a wonderful package to have. And it's one of those things that workplaces really need to adjust to, because if we're going to start dismissing people for all their lived experiences, good or bad, we're not going to have much of a diverse workforce.
Yeah,
That's right.
That comes back to the stigma, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think just that the research will tell us, particularly with substance use treatment, that the research tells us that having lived experience positions, consumer positions within a treatment service, helping people to navigate the health system really assists people not only to reach out, but to remain in treatment for the length of time that they need. So we know that they make a huge difference. And we need to do more, actually, particularly in the drug and alcohol sector, to ensure that we've got the right structures and frameworks in place. And there's actually, Dan, some of your colleagues have done some great work in this space, a turning point around that, and certainly here too, and across the country, really, that we're starting to value more and more the peer and consumer and lived experience workforce, and to see how vital they are in supporting people.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Suzie Hudson. We've got a question that's come in a few different formats, so I'll just ask it generally. I actually think, Lucy, you've spoken to this before, so it might be one you can jump in and answer straight away, and that is just that whether you think society's attitude is changing to substance abuse.
Slowly but surely, I guess. I think whilst we still have, concepts like the war on drugs, etc., I think it's quite difficult for us to change stigma and judgment around drug and alcohol use because it's still criminalized. And I'm a very big advocate of decriminalization, of even legalization, because I think the evidence has shown that harm minimization comes with that acceptance and reducing that stigma. If people aren't comfortable with, acknowledging addiction or seeking help for fear of, prosecution, for fear of breaking the law, how are we ever going to help these people? How are they going to help themselves? And so I do think things are changing society-wise. I think policy-wise, we're lacking quite severely. And I think that is the area that we need to look at and examine more closely, because you look at, the people that make up the justice system, and a lot of the time it's drug use. And that is a ridiculous reason to incarcerate someone for a mental health issue. That just shouldn't be the system. And so until that changes, I think we're still going to experience problems with stigmatization and judgment. But, hopefully our society changes its attitudes, policy, law, legislation, that will follow.
Well, thank you.
Can I just follow on from that?
Yes, please.
Look, I think Lucy's really nailed it there. I mean, I think it's been interesting times, hasn't it, over the last decade, because what we've seen is a complete change in how the community talks about mental health. We've seen this discussion of topics that used to be secret, family violence, childhood sexual abuse, issues, LGBTI, transgender, veteran health. whole range of issues that used to be swept under the carpet, nobody wanted to talk about because they were dirty, dark secrets that we weren't ready to have the conversation for. And we've seen a whole transformation in how and what people are talking about now, and a whole transformation in this space around the willingness to explore these issues and to think about solutions that work. So I'm very hopeful that, I think addiction's one of the last bastions in this space of things that nobody wants to talk about, nobody wants to speak about. Part of doing, Addicted Australia was to start that conversation. The conversation we have tonight, which you've already said, Jacinta, is a really important component of this. We all need to be having these conversations. We need to having more of these. We need to encourage it to be on, and have these discussions on TV as much as possible, in the newspapers, in different forums. The more we have this discussion, the more opportunity we have. And the campaign we're running, Rethink Addiction, is about giving a voice, giving that voice to people, getting people to tell their stories. Because the more we have the real stories out there, like we did for those other issues, the more the momentum will be that we have to do something much better than what we're doing at the moment.
Well, that might be a point to end on because we are out of time. Professor Lubman, thank you for that. We unfortunately can't get to all the questions because, gosh, there's some amazing ones that have flooded in. So I do apologise for that. Time, though, is just what it is. But thank you so much to all of the extraordinary speakers tonight. As a parent of young boys, I just found that fascinating, and I'm sure you all did for your own reasons as well. So I just a few things to say, and let me just have a look here. There's some questions that we're not going to get to, and I'm just, yep, okay. I just wanted to remind you that tonight's seminar will be posted, so you can catch up on that if you've missed it or if you want to see it again, because I know there's a wealth of knowledge in there. It's hard to take it all in. Thank you to the extraordinary speakers tonight, Dr. Suzie Hudson, Professor Dan Lubman, Lucy Stronach, and Steve Bastian. You are just such a wealth of knowledge, and all of you together, I think you've pretty much covered everything as a combination in this space. Thank you to all of you who tuned in, and there's so many other things you could have been doing with your time tonight. So to make this a priority is really appreciated. And thank you to the Sir David Martin Foundation and all the absolutely extraordinary work that you do. Good night.